Hi, this is Bill Babcock with Expert Amateur. So our topic today is solar bonding and grounding, which is very boring unless you get whacked by a lightning bolt. Solar installations are sort of a lightning magnet. The metal frames on your roof or in an open area, metal racking, a bunch of wires leading directly into the guts of your equipment. If there's a nearby lightning strike, it'll induce high voltages into your installation, and that can wind up in your equipment. If it does, it's slagged, most likely. So it can be very expensive to not pay attention to this. The proper way to ground your equipment is not completely clear. There's a lot of contention about this and a lot of conflicting information, which is unfortunate, but it's a complicated issue. I'm going to give you what I think is the best possible answer, but not everyone's going to agree with what I have to say. What you probably need to do is ground your racks and your framework of all your panels, bond them all together. Bonding means connecting together. This is an earth ground we're talking about first. So ground your equipment with the typical 8-foot long grounding rod pounded into the ground, and connect a grounding lug to it. Run as straight a piece of number 6 bare copper wire as you can from the equipment you're grounding to the ground rod, and that's a good start. This means you're going to have more than one earth ground for your system, because almost certainly, even if you're off grid, your main panel has ground, and it should, if your house is built to anything remotely resembling code, that should have an earth ground. The safest way to manage your grounding is ground your panels, ground the framework of your panels and your racks locally, and then connect that with a grounding wire to the house ground. That can be a big long run of wire to accomplish that, but that's actually what would be necessary. That's pretty much all you'd really need to know, but I'm going to give you all the background anyway. So there's two kinds of grounding you have to pay attention to with your solar installation. There's the framework of the panels, mounting equipment and other hardware, and then there's the internal wiring grounding. Both types are safety considerations and equipment longevity considerations, but they work differently and they have different concerns. According to the National Electric Code, panel frames, racks, and other metal components of the PV array must be earth grounded separately from general electrical wiring. Even though it's NEC code, having two separated grounds is a problem. An earth ground is not a low resistance ground. It's not like the wiring inside your house. It's a relatively high resistance, and if your ground rods are a pretty substantial distance apart and there's a lightning strike close by, it's going to induce a high voltage between those two ground rods. So you can actually have your grounding system zap your equipment. Connecting all your ground rods together eliminates this for the most part. It means that any increase in potential in one ground rod will be felt in another, disregarding the internal resistance of the wiring. It's a pretty good solution, but it's expensive. And it's a lot of work. I mean, if your PV panels are a long distance away from your service ground, then you're going to be running a lot of ground wire, and copper's not cheap these days. So, transformerless inverters have a tremendous number of really good features. The only downside is there's no inductive decoupling of the AC and DC side. A transformer in between those two pretty much decouples the PV side from the rest of the electronics. So there's a potential, and in fact, it's actually, it happens a lot, to backfeed AC into the DC side of your system. So you can wind up with stray voltages almost anywhere. I mean, it's kind of a tricky thing to track down and eliminate. Generally low current, the backfeeding current is. It's generally low current. It's generally not super dangerous, but it'll shock you. And, you know, if you're up on a roof working away on something and lean over and touch your panels and get a shock, there's a potential for you to fall off the roof. So, so it's worthwhile to make certain that your system isn't doing that to you on a regular basis. So, so proper grounding is essential to both for your personal safety, for the safety of other people, and for the longevity of your equipment. So there's this fellow named Mike Holt. He has a business educating electricians about code and about safety, and it's pretty. He's very well regarded. So he considers a separate earth ground for your panels and racks to be unnecessary and dangerous. Dangerous for exactly the reason I just described. A nearby lightning strike can induce a voltage across the separated ground rods. So the very things you're doing to make the system safer can create a problem. So his point is, don't have a secondary ground. He thinks they're not necessary. I think they are. But I do believe that the safe and most practical way is to connect any earth grounds you have together with adequate wire. I mean, I've been writing this article for a long time, and the article appears on my website, and this video is a paraphrasing of the article. So I've been writing it for quite a while because I kept getting conflicting information. It made it really difficult to finish writing it. So people who have a lot of experience in uninterruptible power supplies and lightning mitigation say that separated ground rods cause a tremendous amount of equipment damage. And back in the 70s, it was kind of a standard practice for any kind of computer installation, which were, you know, mini computers back then, mostly mini computers and mainframes, that they had a separated ground from the system ground, from the electrical system ground. And people who have experience in that industry, in particular a fellow named Mr. Tab, who commented on the DIY panel on Facebook. He said that he would get called out to look at a system that had been destroyed by lightning, despite the fact that it had their equipment in it, and he would always find separated grounds. And so over time, the industry learned, don't do that. So despite the expense of long wire runs and the limited support for having multiple earth grounds, I think that's practical. The cost of your equipment is a lot higher than the cost of maybe a couple hundred feet of copper wire and some ground rods. So that's what I'm eventually going to be doing. What I've done so far with my own system, I have a test system I'm building in containers. With my own system right now, it's running just a localized ground. Right now the system's running as an off-grid system. So there is no service ground that feeds it. So I think I'm in pretty good shape right now. But eventually this will be a complete three-phase system that supplies my entire shop, which is a substantial load, and can take it off grid. But I'll probably always leave the current three-phase power connection in place. It's not easy to get those installed, and it's expensive, and my whole shop is wired for three-phase. So even though I intend to actually supply the entire shop, it will remain grid connected. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to run a great big long, probably 250-foot ground wire to my service ground. So when you do install a localized grounding system, you want that wire to be as straight as possible coming from your equipment to the ground wire. Because lightning does weird things. We're talking about extremely high voltages and massive currents, and it doesn't follow the usual expectations for how currents or voltage is going to, where voltage is going to appear and how current's going to flow. So no sharp bends, straight as possible, and if you're completely off grid, that's probably sufficient. So that's kind of it for lightning. So system wiring grounding is a different animal with different goals. The aim for system grounding is to provide a low impedance path for fault current, to make certain that any kind of electrical fault in your system causes the breakers to trip or the fuses to blow. In almost every case, there should be only one location in your entire electrical system where your neutral wire is directly connected to the ground bus, and then from the ground bus to an earth ground. That location is generally the service entrance or the first disconnect point. NEC code is crystal clear about that. So in off-grid systems, you can do a single neutral ground bond in the main electrical distribution panel, which does the exact same thing it does if you're on grid. It provides a path for faults and a way to trip breakers. If you bond your neutral and ground wires together in other locations other than the main service panel, it creates parallel paths for neutral current to flow on grounding connectors. That's not a great idea. You don't want your ground circuit to have any current on it. All your enclosures, your equipment enclosures can easily wind up with a neutral with voltage on them, and it could be a very dangerous voltage. That's a good way to get electrocuted. So that's really about it. It's a big issue, and as I said several times, it's a very contentious issue. A lot of people have different ideas about it. I think the safest approach is to combine those ideas. So that's the purpose. I hope you found this useful.